Good evening and welcome to tonight's matchup of round 3 in John's Bachelor Memorial Chess Tournament, so named as it was started right before my wedding and the end of my bachelorhood, which has since concluded. Tonight's matchup is between the number 2 seed, Charlie Larimer, with 2 points as white, and Lenny Shulgin, our number 1 seed, also with 2 points, playing black. But first, I'm getting ahead of myself. Allow me to introduce my co-commentator, Andrew Hoy. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Andrew is a national master in the USCF. He has also been my friend for entirely too long. We were co-captains of the Zavarian Brothers chess team in Westwood, Massachusetts. Andrew, what years were those?
Oh God, that was 2006 to 2009.
Great. Yes, thank you.
We're going to date ourselves.
Yeah, seriously. We are in chess, we are extremely old dogs already, which is incredibly sad to say. We could still be pro athletes, and yet somehow we're too old to be chess players. But yeah, so thank you all for joining us, those of you who are here. I would love to tell you a little bit about our players this evening. So I'm going to try and get this in before the game gets started. Playing, as I said, with the white pieces, we have Charlie Larimer. Charlie Larimer is a health actuary now living in Denver, Colorado. He started playing chess as a young boy when his father taught him and his brother the rules. His interest in chess escalated with the famous Fischer-Spassky chess match in 1972, and he feels that playing chess is very much like playing the piano. So that's what I have for Charlie. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about his challenger with the black pieces?
Absolutely. So with black, we have Lenny Shulgin. Lenny is a programmer currently living in Brooklyn. He learned to play chess when he was only 3 from his father, and Lenny proceeded to just get absolutely crushed by his father for the next several decades. However, Lenny has been playing Blitz online, so he only has to suffer for a couple minutes at a time, and we should have a pretty good matchup tonight between the two of them.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it is important to note that I think a lot of the players in our tournament are accustomed to playing Blitz. So one of the things that's going to be interesting to look out for is whether the players can contain themselves, slow down a little bit, and make use of the extra time. As, of course, the time control for this evening's game is game 45 with a 5-second increment. So, Andrew, what is the role of the 5-second increment in a game like this? Why do we have that?
So, if we're really going back for history, the 5-second increment started because people would play with analog clocks and just run out of time. And there was really nothing you could do with that analog clock ticking away. And hang on, I'm told that our game has just started, so let me pull that up on the big board.
Fantastic. Yeah, and, let's take a look.
We'll just leave that up until they get going. But the increment, it started out as a delay in a lot of chess, but now that it's a 5-second increment, every single move you'll get an extra 5 seconds. And that means that if you get to some sort of end game where it's technically winning, even though you don't have much time, there will be enough time to convert the game and put it away.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. That does tend to lead to a more exciting game in the sense that the ending is not arbitrary. Right? We don't simply have an ending that comes down to whoever could move faster.
Exactly.
Okay, looks like we're up and running. So we do have a Queen's Gambit declined, and it looks like Charlie, with the white pieces, has decided to keep his dark squared bishop in. Andrew, is that a main line, or is bishop g5 the usual way for players to play in this situation?
This is a line. Bishop g5 is a little bit more normal, but this is something that's kind of become more popular. It's usually through a Catalan structure, so if the bishop goes to g2 instead, that you'll see this type of setup. But this is also totally fine, and it's a way for white to play.
Got it.
Bishop d3 was a little bit quick. I'm a little bit surprised by that. I think it's okay, but this does give black a chance to take on c4 and pick up a tempo.
Got it. Yeah, I do remember actually talking with Lenny before this evening's game, and he was saying that he had looked at Charlie's other Lichess Blitz games and had seen that he played the Catalan, and he said, I have no idea how to play against that, so I will try to move order him into a position I'm more familiar with.
Nice.
Charles, on the other hand, announced that his only concern for this game was that he didn't want to, quote, hang his queen in front of all these people.
So,
Okay.
can you tell us a little bit about the tournament standings? I know that this is the top game, but how much is on the line here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. This is an interesting point in the tournament. So we are planning on playing a full 7 rounds. So in round 3, there's still an awful lot of space for people to change lead and find their way. But on the other hand, coming into the tournament, Lenny with a rating of around 1940 and Charlie at 1876 are the top 2 seeds. Beneath them, we have Rufus Bear with a rating of around 1863, and then Brian Curry at 1765. But the field drops fairly steeply after the top 5 or 6 spots. So while this is such an early round that it seems ridiculous to call it decisive, I would say that if either player wins here instead of draws, it could lead to a pretty significant lead because they're probably going to be favored in most of the rest of their games.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's return to the action. Okay, so we have Queen E2 from Charlie. Looks like maybe he's planning on pushing a fast E4 at some point. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, I would, and I think e4 is a pretty strong idea in a lot of these positions, especially with this bishop on d6. White will have the option to play e5 and fork the pieces, so black's going to have to deal with that threat. It's a more serious threat than it might otherwise be.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the obvious thing there would be after e4 to just immediately take, but then of course the center will be open and white should get some nice piece play with maybe a chance to attack on the king side.
Right.
Absolutely. Fabulous. I must say I'm not as familiar with a lot of these positions, being a career e4 player myself, and I tend to go for the Slav, which leads to entirely different structures from this. I think the last time that I was playing Queen's Gambit Decline structures was probably when we were on the Zavarian Brothers chess team.
Yeah, that's going back a ways.
Absolutely. Looks like the players are being good about using their time, which does mean we will have some space to fill, but on the other hand, we'll have much higher quality chess.
So I think we're already getting to some interesting positions. So just to familiarize everybody with the stream layout, this is our analysis board, the big board over on the left, and the live position is over on the right. So they should be the same most of the time, but when we start to get into analyzing variations, we'll be doing it on the big board. One thing that's interesting is with all of these pieces on the D file, white does have some ideas of attacking the black pieces. So, for example, just one arbitrary line. If black decides to play a move like c5, and maybe black wants to prepare it by taking first, all of a sudden there's a lot going on this D file, and black can have a little bit of trouble with the piece coordination. So a move like, just for example, knight takes c5. Already a move like knight b5 is going to be pretty strong, attacking this bishop a lot of times.
Absolutely. Yeah, this actually, thank you, Andrew. That's excellent commentary and really helpful. And it reminds me of something that I've often talked to a lot of the players in this tournament about, which is putting a rook on the queen early in the game when there's significant obstacle in the way can often lead to a decisive result later on. So it's interesting. Very often early novice players, less experienced players, don't see the worth of something like rook f to d1 when there's so much in the way, but suddenly a few things get exchanged, right? We have a pawn capture and we have a lethal threat on board.
Yeah, definitely. And just to jump back to the live position, Lenny just played knight e4, which I think is a much better move than c5 immediately. It tries to put the knight on its best square on e4, and black can think about using the other knight to come to f6 and support the knight on e4.
Absolutely. An easy way to blunder here would be to play something like knight takes e4 for white,
Mm,
right? When the immediate d takes e4, right, leads to a fork of the light squared bishop and the knight on f3. So something to watch out for, right? When you get a little too take happy, sometimes you can run into very immediate trouble. Going back to the earlier point, Andrew, I often find that it's a useful prophylactic move to sometimes just put the queen on a different file from my opponent's rook immediately if I have no idea what else to do. So even something like queen e7 was
right.
something I was considering just to avoid any trouble, especially in blitz, right? In shorter time controls, this can be a really useful way to just keep yourself from disaster.
Yes. So this is already an interesting position, just because a move like knight e4 is very committal. And granted, it's a relatively quiet opening, and all of a sudden, black is trying to launch some attacks on the white king with these bishops. I think black has a couple of ideas for attacking. I think the next thing that black will have to do is decide where to put the queen. And the next question for white is really going to be, how do we develop this dark square bishop?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons that I tend to, when I play this kind of way as white, which I will admit is rare, but I tend to favor the lines in which white develops the dark squared bishop early by playing bishop g5, because there are far fewer questions about what to do with it later.
Right. So one example line, white might like to play b3 and bishop b2, but obviously that's going to fail right away because the knight is hanging. So to solve that, white ended up taking on e4, and we got to
Mm.
this position.
I gotta say, I don't know how I feel about that. I think Charlie's given up the light squared bishop awfully quickly. I think he's now going to find it a little bit more difficult to attack the king side without that light squared bishop to put pressure on, for example, the h7 square. Also, you can see now that the center. Well, what's going on with the center, Andrew?
I'm not sure. I think black is supporting this pawn pretty well at the moment, but there are an awful lot of knights attacking it. So black's going to have to come up with some plan to defend that pawn immediately and then figure it out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about something like f5, followed by maybe taking the d7 knight and putting him on f6?
I like that a lot. I think with the pawn on e4, black really has to think about attacking on the king side. The pawn structure long term is going to be better for white. Black does have the bishop pair, so I think that's something to be said for black's position. But right away, moves like queen h4 start to become considerations. Just checkmate ideas are there right away.
Absolutely. You know, I was having a conversation with a student just this afternoon about queen h5, queen g4, and of course, in this case, the same idea but reflected in black's position, queen h4 and queen g5, saying you always want to be on the lookout for these moves because not only are they very powerful attacking moves that put the queen in a good place, but of course, the virtue of getting there first is if white plays, for example, queen h5, then black cannot play queen h4 himself.
Right.
So it's a nice combination of attack and defense. So black should definitely be looking to do something like that because it prevents white's queen from getting active in addition to his own increasing his own activity.
Yes, I think that makes perfect sense. I think this is a good moment for black to spend some time and really consider the position and think about the best way to continue because whatever move he plays now is really going to determine the course of the game for the next several moves.
I think that makes sense. So while we're waiting to see what black does, Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your history with the game, and where are you?
Sure. So I live in Boston, Massachusetts. As John said, we went to high school together. That was really when I started playing chess more seriously. I had learned how to play chess from a childhood friend way back when I was probably 5, but I never really took it seriously until high school. And even the difference between freshman and sophomore years was a big difference. Once we started playing on a regular basis, it really kind of started to click for me.
Looks like we do have a move on board.
Mm-hmm.
So Lenny has gone with the F5 plan that I was thinking about. I did have a conversation with the players earlier today in which Lenny asked if it was all right for them to watch the stream, and I told him emphatically no. So we'll hope that neither of the
Excellent.
players has given in to temptation and will be looking in on us, because that would probably spoil the game pretty thoroughly.
They can watch the VOD later.
Exactly, exactly.
They can hear the ruthless mocking of the weak moves later.
I have to say, Charlie, you have already been successful in not hanging your queen. I have to think you're doing pretty well. So you have to feel good about that much at least. But I will say I do really like Black's position here. I think that Black's pieces are very active.
Mm. So, John, I know you play the Dutch as Black. What do you think about the position right now? It's more of a classical Dutch that you're used to than something that I'm used to.
Yeah, well, so things, I mean, let me think here. So, as far as looking at a classical Dutch situation, I can see the similarity in that Black has gotten in this F5 move. Of course, it is a little bit of an unusual structure because usually in a classical Dutch, Black is trying to play E5. And of course, here that doesn't look like it's necessarily the right plan. I think probably there White would push D5 and shut the at minimum shut the light squared bishop out of the game. But aside from that, looking at this just as it is, I have to feel like this is a very strong attacking position for Black. So normally in something like this, I'd be looking to try and play F4 and try and get that Black pawn down, open up even more of these diagonals, right? Get some pawn exchanges and try and play for a quick checkmate. I wouldn't play F4 right away. I think probably we want to get Queen H4 in first. But then now I think about it, does that allow White to close things up by playing F4 himself? What do you think about that?
I don't know. And that's a. When you said F4, I was thinking maybe White can just sacrifice the pawn and play F4. It's something like this. I mean, we're hanging E4 to 3 different pieces, but I think there's certainly some compensation for the pawn.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I guess we'll have to see.
I think in this specific position, White could probably take with the knight and be totally okay. Something like this is should be holdable for White. These
Yeah.
sacrifices really don't come to anything when the queen can defend very easily.
No, absolutely. And we see also the benefit of having those what what we say the redundant knights on C3 and E4 because even the opportunity, for example, looking at that line again for just a moment, to
Sure.
exchange on E4, White just replaces it again with another
Mm.
knight, and everything is still completely solid.
Yes, definitely. It does look like we have a couple more moves. Black ended up taking on F3. And, I still like Black's position an awful lot. I think there are still going to be some good attacking ideas, either C5 or E5 at the right moment.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think you have to be feeling good if you're playing Black. Certainly, this has not been what we all fear when we play Black, which is that we have been put in a vice and are unable to get any play. I think this is going to get exciting.
Yeah, I agree. So one crazy idea, so to speak, would be to play G5 right away. And the idea of G5 is to push G4 and then figure out how to continue the attack.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, I have to say, in addition to being aggressive and threatening, that it is also very scary just from a psychological standpoint, right? Something like that can really scare the white player and force him into a bad move that he might not otherwise have made.
Right, definitely.
Something that you that I think is very important in chess, and something that is difficult to hold on to as a lesson, is this idea of playing the most complicated move that you can find very often, right? I mean, well, I guess Andrew, I welcome your commentary on this, but I've sort of learned through time that very often when I can't decide on two particular courses of action, that it's often better to do the more complicated thing, even if I'm not sure, because it creates that same lack of surety in my opponent and can spread confusion. Whereas doing something that's maybe a little safer and a little clearer can make things easier on my opponent as well.
Yeah, I like that approach. I think it's important that you are checking everything to make sure you're not going to hang a queen. But once you've decided on that, I think a lot of times the complicated and messy positions give you chances to both outplay a higher rated player. If something gets really messy, players of all levels can make mistakes. But at the same time, if you're a stronger player, you can probably calculate more efficiently and more accurately than your lower rated opponent.
Fabulous. I do notice one thing that Lenny does not have going for him in this position, despite the activity, is that he is starting to incur a pretty significant time disadvantage. Andrew, do you have any kind of rough rule of thumb for the kind of number of minutes involved and how that starts to affect the position when there's such a difference between the two players' clocks?
A little bit. I think the rule of thumb that I always fall back on is a time advantage of 15 minutes when your opponent has 5 minutes is worth about 200 rating points. So I try and get to that time advantage when I have more time, and I try to avoid that time disadvantage when I'm behind. One other thing is if you think your position on the board is really lousy, then I think it's even more important to play quickly and make the position complicated and messy, so long as you don't play so quickly that you miss an opportunity to save the game.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. All too often, in situations where one player has a significant time advantage, I find that the player with the time advantage starts playing quickly. And I agree with you completely that if that player is behind, a lot of the time that makes sense, right? To continue to press the one advantage that they have. But very often I also see players do it when they're ahead. And I think that's completely the wrong approach, because typically playing the best move is actually what causes your opponent to burn even more time,
Definitely.
rather than this thing, this practice of rushing.
Right. So I actually think the position that we have on the board is kind of a critical moment for black. And the reason that I think it's a critical position is that if white has the chance to play d5, I think white's position is going to be very strong. So black has to do something strong enough to prevent or make d5 useless. And I think that really is if black is lazy for one move, if black plays a move like king h8 thinking it'll protect the king, the move d5 is going to be very, very strong, and then I'd say white's at least equal and probably better with the better structure.
That's interesting. So what is it about this move d5? I mean, obviously we are playing in the center, right, and starting to gain space, but what else about that move makes you feel that it is such a swing in momentum?
I think that since white has already traded off the light square bishop on e4, black's light square bishop is the strongest minor piece in the position. And that's certainly open for debate because black's dark square bishop is a close runner-up for the strongest minor piece. So white needs to do something to blunt the power of the bishop, and d5 is the move that immediately jumps to mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just
Yeah,
to put a totally contrived line on the board, a position like this is already very, very strong for white. White can think about playing a move like e4. White can even think about putting the bishop on the long diagonal and doing some attacking of his own. So this is already a critical position, and black would have problems to solve. A move like c6 isn't really going to work just because of these discoveries, and it blocks the bishop.
Yeah, absolutely. That does look like a very miserable piece on that b7 square. It's interesting as we look at that sideline, I have to say, or possible continuation. One of the things that strikes me looking at it is the way that we see how White's problem piece suddenly has a very clear plan of being solved, right? I mean, even
Mm.
in addition to moving b3 and then placing the bishop on the a1 to h8 diagonal, we also have this idea of just simply bishop d2, bishop c3, and not moving the pawn at all. But this piece, which had proved such a difficulty just a few moves ago, right, if White is allowed to go for what he wants, suddenly becomes a piece that anyone can place effectively.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And if you can come up with a clear plan for development, usually you have a pretty decent position.
Absolutely. It's funny when I was first learning the game alongside you, really, because like you, well, actually, I guess we haven't talked about that, and now's as good a time as any. Well, we do have a move on the board, so let's go there first.
Yes, it looks like black played knight f6. So black's trying to control these light squares with the knight to stop white's ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. That looks very sensible, and that does seem to address your d5 concerns.
It really does.
So, as I was saying, while we wait for White's response, my history with the game is somewhat similar. I first learned the game of chess actually around 5 years old from my father, who, like Lenny's father, used to beat the snot out of me on a regular basis. But my dad was not a very serious player himself. So although he was more than enough to beat me, I didn't really start to learn the more advanced strategies and tactics of the game until high school, when I entered at Zavarian Brothers High School and joined their chess team. That was where I really cut my teeth, so to speak. And from there, it's been just a gradual deepening over the years into from a game that I enjoyed among many other games to a game I had some particular skill at. And then when I moved to New York and started taking private lessons at the now unfortunately closed Village Chess Shop in Greenwich Village, it really became kind of an obsession. And when I became a chess teacher quite a few years later, that was even yet another intensifier. So it's been kind of a gradual process for me of sort of getting into the game. And one of the reasons that I like telling that story is to emphasize to people that chess can be for life. It is not something that you have to have this initial magnificent promise at in order to enjoy. You can come at it in whatever way you like and let the gradual progression kind of take you away.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm a big fan of sitting on a conference call and playing a couple of bullet games. So chess can be exactly as much as you want it to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm all for sitting on a conference call and playing 100 bullet games.
Yes.
It does have that addictive quality to it.
It's really hard to decide what to do with white right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think bishop d2 makes a certain amount of sense, trying to develop this problem piece that we've been discussing. And maybe he's thinking about putting it on e1 and even bringing
Yeah.
it all the way over to the king side. What do you think about that plan?
I think that's an interesting plan. I don't know that I like bishop d2 as much just because it immediately gives up the pressure on the d file. So it's a little bit of a concession for the rook being on d1.
That is a really excellent point. Yeah, that I actually admit I did not notice. I am familiar with ideas like this, these little maneuvers from playing the French defense, where black, to quickly look at this here, black very often has this pawn structure of much like where we started, although now it looks unrecognizable, but d5, e6, and f7.
Somehow
And
we
this
have to
light
move that
squared
pawn back.
bishop ends up completely trapped. I'm sorry, Andrew, what was that?
We have to move the black pawn back to f7 to really get to these French structures.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, playing as someone once joked about this f5 move, right? That's very often in such positions the most effective move is f7 back to f5
Yes.
because of the weakness of the king. But I don't think Lenny's got any of that concern right now. I think his king seems quite safe, especially without the light squared bishop that was traded off earlier in the game.
Exactly right.
But as I was saying, Andrew, very often in the French we have this problem light squared bishop on c8, and sometimes what Black will do in those positions is maneuver d7, e8, and finally find life on the king side. So it looks like White's trying to pull a maneuver that's somewhat similar, but of course he is going to give up a lot of time in doing that.
Yeah, and I think if White has the time to get the bishop to h4, for example, I think that could be a very good position for White, just because the last piece has been developed, and then a move like rook c1 is a very natural move to put the rooks on good files.
Absolutely, yeah. But I'm looking at this position. I have to say I'm worried about immediate attacking possibilities from Black that are going to come uh, far too forcefully and far too quickly for this slow plan of e1 and then h4 to happen. I think Black seems to have a number of ways to prevent it. Andrew, what do you think about playing h6 here? Is that, with the idea of perhaps following up with g5? Do you think that's a little slow, or exactly what Black should be going for?
Yeah, I do think that's a little bit slow. I like what Black played. Black played c5 just to try and open up the position, because Black does have the bishop pair, so an open position is beneficial for Black. And this kind of is taking advantage of the temporary position of this bishop on d2, because there are not so many threats with the rook lined up with the queen right at this exact moment.
That's very good. Yeah, taking immediate advantage of that feature that you noticed in the position.
So this is actually an interesting moment, because I think White has to seriously consider playing a move like d5 here. Even if it temporarily gives away a pawn, I think it could just be a strong way to continue and to try and take advantage of the better pawn structure that White might end up with due to this f5 pawn.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we take a look at what that might look like?
Sure. So if White decides to push d5, we would probably end up with something like this. Now, in this particular position, White is going to have ideas of queen c4 or knight b5. So there are a couple of good moves that are immediately considerations. After queen c4, we're attacking this knight, and I think we're just winning the knight right away. A move like bishop e7 to defend the knight an extra time with the queen. Well, now we can continue with your plan of bishop e1, and all of a sudden this rook is joining the fun on d5.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That could be an issue.
Yeah, it definitely would be a huge issue. So Black has to come up with something different, and if Black takes this way, I think we're going to end up with something very, very similar here, where this knight is just going to run into trouble on d5.
Looks like we have another move on the board. We have White continuing with this plan
Okay.
of bishop e1, trying to maneuver his way around.
Yeah, so I think that's also a reasonable way to continue. I do like d5 just because of the tactical moment and the threats that White had, but I think that bishop e1 is totally fine, and it's certainly not going to spoil anything. Moves like
Absolutely.
this aren't really a threat to the White position.
Yeah, that does make sense, since White will be able to recapture with a pawn and not lose any key squares in the middle.
Exactly.
It is interesting to note now that because of White's play, this queen h4 maneuver has been really stopped cold. I mean, between the knight on f3 and the bishop on e1, none of these threatening queen moves that I was talking about earlier in the game are going to be able to come to fruition. So what do we do with the queen in this a position like this?
I'm not
for black?
sure. Maybe c7. C7 is another natural square for the queen in a lot of these Slav positions. Usually c7 or e7, depending on where the rooks are going to end up. In this position, c7, I like it a little bit more because we're threatening to take on h2 if this knight ever moves.
Absolutely. Yeah, that does put a little bit of pressure on him and maybe leads to exchanges in the center, offering white a little bit more question as well.
Right.
That actually is another feature that's worth noting in the position, I suppose, that now that this bishop has come off of the d file, we now again have access to these pinning threats against black's queen.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's a strong argument to move the queen right away.
Yeah, so we are going to be looking for that. Yeah, something like queen c7 probably has more teeth than I think queen e7, where I'm not exactly sure why the queen is playing there, as I think e5 is not a real idea here.
I think you're right. I think after e5, white can simply take on e5 and be at least equal. It probably leads to an opposite bishop position.
Absolutely. And what can you tell us actually, Andrew? That's a wonderful point. What can you tell us as sort of rough understanding as to what characterizes an opposite bishop middle game, which of course is so distinct from the very drawish opposite bishop endgame?
Sure. So black just moved queen b8, so it's a similar idea to queen c7. But let's indulge for a brief moment and look at a move like queen e7. So if we got to a position like this, and white would black's forced to take on e5 because we're forking the two pieces. I think this is an interesting position to look at. Both sides have an unopposed bishop, so the light squares are always going to be weak for white, and black doesn't have a counter to the dark square bishop. So white is always going to have an extra piece on the dark squares, which leads to the rule of thumb in a middle game with opposite color bishops. You really want to attack as quickly and as effectively as you can because you're going to have an extra piece if you are attacking on the correct color complex.
Absolutely. I find that a very common misunderstanding of the opposite colored bishop situation, one that I myself have suffered from, is this idea that they are drawish in all situations, when in
Mm.
fact, end games are drawish, but sometimes the middle games can be extra sharp because of, as you said, this extra piece for both sides. So, Andrew, do you see any extra merit in the idea of queen b8 as opposed to our previously discussed move of queen b7?
I don't think
C7,
so.
excuse me, C7, forgive me.
Yes, yeah. I think the only reason that b8 is so in some lines of the Maroczy bind, you'll see moves like queen b8. And generally, if you're going to do that, the idea is so that you can get the queen to a square like a7 or b7. In this case, I don't think putting the queen on a7 serves any real purpose. So I would have preferred to put the queen on c7. It just gives the queen a little bit of extra flexibility that it doesn't have on b8. And the rook on a8 is really not liking the position of the queen on b8.
Absolutely. It seems like Black's main concern, if I had to guess, was this move knight b5, forking queen and dark squared bishop. But Andrew, it seems like you are not as concerned about that move.
Yeah, not entirely. I mean, I don't love it. I don't want to give up the dark square bishop, but I think that with this structure, that would have, even here, I would probably be okay with a position like this, just because the e3 pawn is isolated if white takes on c5. If white doesn't take on c5, black's going to have strong ideas of taking on d4 and hopping onto these light squares with the queen. So I don't think the fork is so much to be concerned about. But at the same time, I definitely understand the desire to not immediately give away a bishop for a knight.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I can see the merit of that, and I have to admit that I might have made a similar decision because I would be so loath to give up my bishop pair. But of course, in doing this, we do see that there's going to be some problem with developing this a8 rook and getting him into the game, because that queen is definitely a boulder in the way.
Right. And the other thing to note is that if white trades off this knight, The black knight can come to e4 more or less with impunity because the bishop doesn't exist anymore. The light square bishop doesn't exist anymore to threaten to trade for it.
Absolutely. Looks like we do have a couple more moves on board.
Yeah, so white played d5, and again, I really like this d5 idea. I think it's a very strong move to shut down this bishop. And black captured on d5, and now white really has to think about how to recapture on d5 to take advantage of the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess just looking at it with my inexpert eyes, I would say that immediately what occurs to me is that taking with the pawn, c takes d, will keep more pieces on the board and bottle things up a little bit more temporarily, whereas knight takes allows more immediate exchanges and is willing to get wild.
Yeah, I do like taking with the pawn, the same way that your initial thought was to take with the pawn. I think mine is as well. And in fact, that's what Charles played. So I think that's kind of a. We have a consensus for taking with the pawn.
Fabulous. Yeah, absolutely.
So, one thing to note, and this is just something that both players have to keep in the back of their mind, this d5 pawn is a passed pawn. White can, in 3 short moves, make a new queen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not to be underestimated.
I think it's especially strong with these knight b5 ideas. It forces this bishop away from the blockading square and would let white threaten to push the pawn even further.
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. You know, one of the things that I find really intimidating about letting my opponent have a pass pawn like this is, as I'm looking, the engine does show some significant advantage for black in this position, which I find interesting. But you know, it's interesting to note sort of the human quality of a position like this is that White's plan when he has a pass pawn becomes so simple, as you say, right? A few simple pawn pushes and he gets home. And sometimes that alone, the fact that his plan is sort of easy to understand and easy to follow, can be in itself an advantage where a computer sees no value in this. It thinks about all positions roughly the same way.
Right. That's a really good point. I think at the end of the day, black still has the bishop pair, and black still has some really nice diagonals for his pieces. Another rule of thumb is that if you have a good diagonal for each of your bishops and your queen, that's probably worth a pawn. So it's almost worth sacrificing a pawn to get a position like this where all 3 of the diagonal pieces are working pretty effectively.
Absolutely.
So it looks like black played knight g4, immediately threatening the h2 pawn, and white replied by pushing h3 to prevent that.
Yeah, that seems like probably the right move. I'm not a fan of these H3 moves very often when they are purely prophylactic, keeping a piece out. Very often they can be a little slow, a little bit time wasty, right? They have to be considered carefully. But when it comes to kicking away a dangerous piece like the knight on G4, I start to see the value a little more.
Yeah, I think one thing to just be aware of is it does weaken the g3 square. In some of those lines that we were talking about with moves like knight b5 and taking on d6, that was strong because we could follow it up with bishop g3 to chase away the queen if the queen comes to d6.
Right. Yeah. Now White's cost himself that option.
I'm having a hard time making moves. There we go.
And
So black went back with the knight right away, and now white hopped into b5 with the knight.
okay, so we will see what black wants to do with that dark squared bishop, whether he wants to allow white to trade it off for his knight, or if he wants to, for example, go for something like bishop g3, trying to trade it for its opposite number in the white camp.
Right. So this actually leads to an interesting moment. I think both sides need to calculate what happens if black takes on d5 in this position.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That is kind of. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So I think if black takes on d5, let's start with taking with the bishop because I think that is a little bit more of a forcing line. White can think about taking this way, and then we have this same pin that we were talking about before. And this is actually an interesting position because black doesn't have a single way to defend the knight unless it's queen b7, and queen b7 gives away this dark square bishop, so that's really not a move that you can think about.
Absolutely. What we call a departure effect error, right? Black remembers the idea of protecting, but forgets that his queen is already employed.
Yes, exactly. Actually, so bishop takes d5 just happened. So this position is on the board.
Oh boy, let's see. Let's see how white chooses to handle this. This could end up being quite a big swing in the opposite direction.
Yes, no kidding. And I think this is it really speaks to the difference. The chat suggestion that black really needed to do something with this rook and queen. It's really interesting because white's active rook is really going to rule the day if he finds rook takes d5 here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is very interesting that both players have not been able to activate their A file rook yet. And so the relative disadvantage of black's camp has been irrelevant. But the fact that this other rook, this F rook, if you will, after castling, that white has found a way to employ his on the D file seems to be making the difference.
Right. So white actually found a different way to do something very similar with bishop c3, and I think this is just going to win a piece, so this looks pretty clean at the moment.
Interesting, interesting. So, you know what? I have to admit, and I'm not seeing it just yet. Can we not? Would we not have time to make any trades here? Something like bishop f3, getting rid of one of our weaknesses.
I think that this is going to. I think there are too many loose pieces at the moment, though. I don't see a great way for black to continue and keep an eye on everything. Maybe black can get away with something like this, but again, this is a very weak piece over here, and we can even consider moves like this activating the rook, and a move like rook b7 is a large threat, as is knight c7.
Yeah, absolutely. That rook entering on the 7th rank is scary. And not least for what it allows the A rook to do, which is come in and back its brother up and plan to penetrate as well.
Exactly. And we're going through these lines a little bit quickly, so I'm sure we're missing some interesting positions as well, but it's certainly telling that both of the bishops are loose on the d-file right now. So I think black's definitely going to have to give away the bishop pair in the next move or two.
Absolutely. I have to say, my concern going into this game was feeling like it might feel a little slow, but I think, to the contrary, that the action has moved along at a pretty good pace, and we're getting some very interesting chess that's solidly played.
Yeah, I agree. I think game 45 is a sneaky good time control. I think it's fast enough that you get a lot of action and it's fun to watch. And it's still slow enough to be able to calculate and think about the moves when you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. I can remember attending in person the Magnus Carlsen versus Sergei Karyakin World Championship match was that 2013, Andrew? I don't know if you remember any better than I do.
It might have been 2015 or 2016. I think it was more recent than that.
Very good. I'm actually going to look it up here while we're...
Excellent. So we actually have the line that John gave about taking on f3 on the board. So this is the position on the board that white is considering right now. Or I'm sorry, it's black's move here.
Of course, yeah, queen f3 seems natural. There's no reason to consider g takes f there.
Right.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It was more recently. It was actually 2016. Carlsen had won the world championship in 2013 against Viswanathan Anand, which might have been what I was thinking of. Mm. But as I was saying, I remember going to that match to watch one of the games, and the time control there was substantially longer than anything we're going to be looking at here. I'm actually, I confess, going to see if I can find the 100 minutes only for the first 40 moves, followed by an additional 50 minutes each for the next 20, and then 15 minutes to each player to finish the game if it had not yet. All of this time, as a baseline. In addition to that, each player was given a 30-second increment per move. So that game, compared to this, was something like reading the entirety of The Lord of the Rings in comparison to just getting through The Hobbit.
Right.
And I have to say that watching that game, as exciting as a setting as it was, as unbelievable as the stakes were, I found it was not unlike watching paint dry. So I'm very happy to be seeing something here that clips along a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I just want to point out one tactic that's in the position. If black tries to defend this bishop this way with the rook, that's going to run into queen d5 check. Now, it's very important that we don't play queen d5 check right away because Charlie said he didn't want to hang a queen. But if he takes here first, then he's fine with this queen d5 check, and the bishop will fall to the knight.
Absolutely, very good. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, there were ideas actually earlier in the position. I remember earlier in the game there were these ideas of even tucking the king away on h8 in order to avoid that queen coming to that square with check, and that allowing black some more defensive capabilities.
Yes, exactly. All right, so again, I think there's a chance for white to win a whole piece in this position again. So I think this is a moment where white should go slow and make sure he finds the win in this position.
Oh, it looks like he didn't take your advice.
Well, he found the right move, so I can't fault him too much. So he took on d6, and after black takes back with the knight, obviously taking back with the queen is no good because the rook can capture. White has two very strong ideas. He has this idea of bishop e5 pinning the queen, and unfortunately it looks like he got the move order slightly wrong. So what I was going to say is bishop e5, and then if it's defended, now we can throw in this check, and this is going to be a very strong position because if black plays knight f7, white is actually going to be up in exchange at the end with a rook for the knight.
Yeah, very threatening indeed. So what's the flaw in this move order?
So by not pinning the knight, by playing queen d5 immediately, now black has the opportunity to play knight f7, and all of the pieces are remaining on the board and safe.
Oof, that's got to be a bit of a heartbreaker. I have a feeling that Charlie missed that somewhat unusual maneuver, right? It's not very often you see the knight come to f7.
Yeah, and unfortunately for white, black did find knight f7. Now that said, I still think that this is a good position for white. Just to kind of talk a little bit more abstractly about the position, a bishop is generally better than a knight as the position starts to open up. So because there are so few center pawns, it's a lot of open files in the middle, this bishop is much stronger than its counterpart on f7.
Absolutely. We have a question in the chat about what the strengths are of each position. Andrew, I think you've done a really excellent job of summarizing the strengths of white's camp here. Is it fair to say that maybe the strength of black's camp, if any, would be that more of the pawns around white's king have been moved, creating maybe some possible chances for a counterattack or even a perpetual? What else do you see in white's camp that maybe black can look to exploit?
I think it's kind of counterintuitive, but the white queen on d5 is definitely going to give black a chance to pick up at least one tempo at some moment. So if black had all the time in the world, and we'll just make a total pass move, a move like queen g3 is an interesting idea. It hits this e3 pawn, and if white defends that, let's say with rook e1, that's almost certainly not the best way to defend it. Now all of a sudden, black's rooks are getting very active, and this knight might be able to find a good square on e4 with enough time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that does look like it has some possibilities. So once again, it's interesting always, and we can do this for any game of chess I think that's been played, to see how early pawn moves, right,
Mm.
even a few turns ago, like h3, right, can lead to very critical weaknesses later on.
Yes, definitely. And this g3 square is a sneaky good square for the black queen, and a move like bishop e5 might look good to attack the queen because it's pinned, but this idea of queen takes e5 is always in the position because when you capture, the knight is no longer pinned and can recapture on e5.
Absolutely, yeah, a wonderful sequence to point out something that it looks so tempting and is so easy to fall into for newer players. So it looks like Lenny has decided to maneuver his queen instead to e8,
Yeah.
relieving some of the pressure, and but allowing White to steal a pawn on f5.
Yeah, and I think this pawn hanging on f5 is kind of the payoff for white for this tactical sequence with this queen check here. I think it's a consolation prize for not getting a whole piece, or maybe an exchange if we went for that complicated line that we talked about before. But white has gotten his pawn back, so it's equal material. And now white has to think about how he can push this e pawn in order to make it an asset instead of a liability.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good point. Yeah, that could be very much the decisive pass pawn or a flimsy weakness that gets picked off. Um, I have
Exactly.
to I have to note here also, I think as we are getting closer to something that might be called an end game, though I think right now we are very much in the late middle, that Black is starting to really uh, give up a significant time disadvantage now, as he is at approaching 10 minutes to Charlie's 31.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that could become a important factor of the rest of the game. That said, 10 minutes, especially with a 5 second increment, is enough to play, well, 10 bullet games. But I think more importantly, there aren't going to be any really, really complicated tactical sequences that have to be calculated carefully. So it's going to be evaluating general ideas of the position and then trying to take advantage of them.
This brings up another excellent point, Andrew, which is I think you'll agree with me here that if anyone asks you, are you thinking about playing Bullet right now? The answer is almost always yes.
Yeah, maybe it's discussed at my previous bullet play, but there's certainly something in my mind.
Absolutely. Bullet is a great game, which is entirely to be avoided if you wish to improve.
Yeah, and anybody who says that bullet and classical chess are the same game is totally mistaken.
Absolutely.
So, what do you think about this position? I think it's kind of an interesting moment for both sides to consider how to finish out the game.
Yeah, well, I if I had Black here, I would have to say I would definitely feel happier now that my knight is unpinned and I have some opportunity to start putting him on a useful square. And if I can manage to get that a8 rook, which we've noticed has been a bit of a plague for quite a while here now, active, I think I've got pretty decent chances to hold this. I don't think that, despite the difficulties in the position, that White is going to have quite enough left on the board or quite enough pressure to bring home the full point. But there's a little bit of awkwardness to solve before that can happen. And I'm also very conscious of very simple ideas like Queen G5 and mate on on G7, excuse me, coming home if that knight
Yes.
moves. Right, or exactly, or Queen G4 happening right now, as you so helpfully pointed out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other idea that White has is Rook D7 and just taking over this seventh rank while he has the opportunity because of the strange coordination of Black's pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really nasty. That is really nasty. I think It would be wonderful if we could find some way to bring this knight out into the game with some kind of useful discovery, but I'm not sure that there is one because knight e5, of course, runs into an immediate capture by the queen
Mm-hmm.
and threatening mate on g7, no
Right.
less, and the exchange of queens, and knight d6, which I think a clever player might try, thinking that these double threats to the queen will allow him to risk the loose piece, are ended immediately by queen d5, which I think should win the game.
Now, in fairness, black can go back, but I think white picks up a very useful tempo in pushing this pawn.
You're absolutely right. A good point. Yeah, I missed that resource.
That said, I think white might have the even stronger move. I'm having a hard time making it, of queen g4, threatening mate here and still hitting this knight here.
Oof.
And you know what? Queen g5 might be more precise because it does not allow queen e7 defending everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That looks even stronger still.
And just as a kind of fun position, if queen d7, which optically appears to cover both d6 and g7, then we have this very strong move, queen d5 check. And now, all of a sudden, this knight is pinned to the queen, so we can't play knight f7 the way we could last time.
Crunch. In fact, I think that position might be even worse than I realized, because am I wrong in saying that maybe also white has the somewhat spectacular rook d6?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, which of course works because if queen takes, right, we end the game. It looks like we do have a couple more moves on board. Lenny decided to finally bring his a8 rook into the game with rook d8, and white replied with playing queen to g4, threatening these checkmate ideas that we've already mentioned. I will say at this moment, Andrew, that we have already had a number of blundered mates in one in this tournament, sometimes commanding positions. So there is absolutely no question that it could happen right now.
Okay, well, black did not hang mate in one. Black took on d1, and white took back with the rooks to keep this mate in one threat alive.
Who can blame him? Yeah, and absolutely. And now rook d7 also continuing to be an idea, entering perhaps decisively on the 7th rank.
Yes, definitely. So I think in this position, the move knight e5 looks like the only reasonable response by black. It immediately blocks this bishop, and it does take control of d7. One thing to note, we cannot take back with the knight because that would be hanging mate in one. But now we can take with the queen because this queen is defended by the knight. And if white chooses to take on e5, well, black is going to be up in exchange in this endgame. And in fact, it's even worse than that because black can immediately pick off the e4 pawn.
Ouch. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Yeah, it's interesting to see the fortunes of this knight as they rise and fall.
Yes.
Right? Awkwardly placed on f7, right? Suddenly coming into its own with a commanding, blockading post on e5.
Yeah, I agree. I think if the queens get traded, black's chances are much better. I still think white's going to be slightly better because a bishop and a rook are generally stronger than a bishop and the knight. And this e4 pawn, instead of being a liability, is actually going to be a slight asset because this rook can come behind it, and this pawn is always going to be threatening to run up the board and make a new queen.
Absolutely. Yeah, wonderful. We do have a couple more moves on board.
Yep, so it looks like knight e5, and then queen g3 was played, so white did not hang the queen. And after queen g3, black went back to g6 to try and stop these mating ideas forever so he doesn't have to worry about it.
Absolutely. And it looks like white has taken advantage of that moving back of the knight by pushing his pawn one more square up the board, getting past that potential blockade.
Yeah, and I think it's important to take a note of the time. So black is now under 5 minutes, and white's playing very quickly still. I think white might have been able to come up with something stronger earlier in the game, but at this point, I think white has excellent chances to win, especially when you factor in that black's not going to have much time to calculate complicated positions.
Absolutely. Yeah, getting down to 4 minutes here, even with getting 5 seconds back every time, is going to put some significant pressure on Lenny to find good moves time after time. If I were playing white here, I would probably play more slowly, but also try to avoid doing anything too concrete to exchange pieces and simplify black's task, unless I could be sure that I was able to maintain pressure. Because, of course, in a simple position, where things are relatively calmer, I think black will have a much easier time, even with only 4 minutes left on the board
I
or on the
think you're
clock.
right, and I think just keeping the queens on, if nothing else, is going to be beneficial for white. There are always going to be queen g7 threats. Black's queen, while it can get active, is going to not have an easy time finding threats like this queen g7 threat. So speaking
Absolutely.
of threats, black is threatening knight e2 check, forking the king and queen. So
Oh,
white played
Charlie.
queen g4 to avoid that.
Oh, Charlie, you're under pressure. What are you going to do? I have to say, with the amount of time Charlie has left, he should definitely be slowly considering knight forks and hanging the queen. It looks like he's done that by playing queen g4, staying alive.
Yeah, and Kulma suggested rook e1 instead of queen g4. I do slightly like rook e1 better than queen g4. I think that putting the rook behind the passed pawn is always a reasonable option, and it does give us some extra options in terms of covering this e2 check square later. After a move like queen g4, in a lot of cases, we would want to play some piece to d7, and now black is going to have the opportunity to play knight e2 and swap off this very strong bishop.
Absolutely. I have to. I see that there are more moves on the board, but I have to break in here because it's given me an opportunity to use one of my favorite quotes about chess by Dr. Siegbert Tarasch, who said, "The rook always belongs behind the passed pawn, except when it is incorrect to do so."
Yes.
But it looks like we have to return to the action here. Lenny has decided to tap out, trying to get the queens off the board, and Charlie did not follow your advice. Seems to have agreed to simplify the position. Perhaps he was nervous about giving something up and losing a game which he was in such command of. But we have seen the queens get traded on g6, and now Charlie has made some benefit by penetrating with his rook to d7.
Yeah, and I think this is probably enough of an advantage for white to consolidate a win, but I do think it's going to be a pretty tall task to win from here. White's going to have to find some very accurate moves over the next probably 5 or 6 moves in order to bring home the full point.
Absolutely. It's interesting to see how Lenny may be cursing himself here now with his time management, because I think Black's task is probably semi comfortable were it not for the fact that he has only 2 minutes remaining.
Right. And actually, I want to go back very quickly. Queen g6, I do like queen g6 because I think the threats against the black king are stronger than the threats against the white king. Uh, After we take here, I think this was an interesting moment for white to consider playing. I'm sorry, for black to consider playing knight e2 check. The white king cannot come to the f file because of this rook, and after a move like king h2, we can still take back with the pawn. And now we are threatening to take off this bishop. And in fact, the bishop doesn't really have a good square. If the bishop goes all the way back to e1, then something like rook to e8 is going to round up this e5 pawn, and I think that's a very strong way to play for black to get back into the game.
Absolutely. That looks very good. It's unfortunate. Very often, very difficult to find those kind of in between moves, especially when under time pressure.
Yes, definitely. And here it looks like black played rook to e8, attacking the pawn, and then white played rook pawn to e6, which creates this threat of rook takes g7.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the temptation to play rook e6 there is not without its dangers.
Yeah, so here, would you take on e6 in order to get rid of that passed pawn, even though you're going to allow black? I'm sorry, you're going to allow white to take off a couple of pawns on the seventh rank, or would you try something like rook e7 and knight f8 and try and hold on for dear life?
Oof, yeah. Looking at this, I I think that I might play this rookie seven idea. I might try to hang on here. It looks, frankly, scary as hell, but the idea of going down another pawn and simplifying the position still further, I'm not sure. But the more that I look at this, the more I see my pieces are tied up. I'm not really able to move, and I'm under massive time pressure. So actually, the more I consider it, I think I might have to go for just simplifying the task, getting rid of the passer, and trying to stay alive. But that is a lot of pawns. As I'm noticing,
Yeah.
if I take on e6, I'm not able to go to h8 because this
No, that would be.
discovery is going to be brutal.
Yeah, and it's not just one discovery that loses a rook, it loses both pieces.
Oof. Yeah, that's a cruncher.
Yes, that would be
Very quickly the game. Yeah,
a
exactly.
really
That's the end
sad
of
way for
that.
the game to end.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
like Black's plan of rook e7. I know it's a scary position to play, but I think that it does give Black the best practical chances. Something like this, there's no way to hold on to this e6 pawn, and even something like this attacking the knight, well, rook f6 is just in time to defend.
Absolutely. So it looks like Charlie's gone with an interesting idea that I like a lot on the face of it. We'll see if it stands up to analysis. But taking advantage of the fact that this knight is pinned on g6, not in the traditional tactical sense of a pin, but in the sense that it has to stay watching the rook on e7, as of course the rook cannot exchange itself for this pass pawn. White will be simply too quick.
Yeah,
And
actually, this is really crazy. So, and Black actually lost his nerve and took on e7, and it looks like we're getting to some of these discovery ideas. And Black is down to his last 10 seconds as he's playing these moves.
oof,
So this is the current position, and Black has only 13 seconds to come up with a move.
ouch.
It looks like he has managed to, though, and I'm sure that White is about to take on h7. And this is actually an interesting position because if Black can trade off these two pawns for any two white pawns, it will be enough to draw. But Black is still going to have to deal with a couple of mating threats, and he's going to have to play some accurate moves with very, very little time left.
Yeah, this is really rough. I have to say, so it's a bit of a shame to see because I do think Lenny has played an excellent game overall, and it's tough to see it come down to essentially a question of who has more time.
Yeah, definitely. So now we've somehow switched from a passed e pawn to a passed g pawn.
Absolutely, absolutely. The difference, of course, being the huge significance of two files and two letters.
Yeah, and Black now is down a pawn instead of somehow having the same amount of pawns. So
Hmm. I like this idea. Okay, so
yeah,
we
so we
have
have a
a
couple
very
moves.
sensible move from Charlie, right? Coming, as we've said, behind the pawns, very often strong. But I do like this idea from Lenny trying to play for knight forks. I think that that's probably not a bad idea. And I think
I
it
agree.
seems attractive to trade the knight for this bishop, maybe splitting up these pawns, giving himself some weaknesses. But what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think you just summarized it extremely well.
Absolutely. Oh, looks like we are going to be in a bit of a scramble here. So bishop g7 check was played, and very quickly king to e8. No surprise that Lenny is moving as fast as he can.
Yeah, and this is a good move. King e8. It's a lot of times you'd like to play king g8 because you're in front of the passed pawn, but here I think there are too many things that you have to worry about with rook g7 forking. So I think that king e8 is a very practical move and avoids a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. Right. The king activating, entering the game. Very good end game principle from Charlie, activating your king and attacking this knight on g3.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like the knight has come back to f5 and followed by bishop c3. and rook to h6 check.
And I really like rook h6 check because it forces the king backwards, since the king cannot come to g3.
Yeah, that's very nice cooperation between the pieces. Very surprising considering that Lenny's playing with almost no time.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's hard to find good moves like this, and he's continuing to find these good moves.
This is proving to be the matchup that I hoped it would be. Okay. Charlie says, all right, I can't get my king out that way. I'll show you king f2.
Yes, and now I like this idea of knight h4 attacking the pawn, and it looks counterintuitive to force the pawn forward, but black is picking up all these attacking ideas on this pawn, and by bringing the pawn forward, it's easier to come up with knight forks at some moment when the pawn is on a inopportune square.
Absolutely. And of course, if it keeps advancing long enough, it's getting closer and closer to black's pieces and his king and farther away from white's king.
Exactly. I also like knight e7 a lot. I think it gives black a chance to get the king out from the last rank. I'm not sure this is going to be the best move, just because it's not possible to come further forward with the king. Rook b6 is always going to be a threat. But at the same time, I think it's something that you have to consider. And it looks like we have some interesting stuff happening really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's tough. We're not going to be able to, maybe a little bit of post hoc analysis is in order.
Exactly. So white played a4, just getting this pawn up the board, and black brought the knight to d5. And arguably, d5 is the best square for the knight in this position, since it can't be attacked by the bishop, and it's controlling these important squares that the white rook would like to have access to.
Absolutely. Followed, if I'm not mistaken, by king f3 and then knight b4, perhaps playing for more ideas of trying to make forks. Okay, bishop c7 is now on board. This game is going too quickly for its commentators.
Yes, and black replied with knight b5 to defend the b6 pawn and hit the bishop. So there are some threats of rook g7 with pinning ideas. So yeah. White went back to f4, and it looks like black took his chance to capture this pawn, following the principle that rook endgames are easier to draw than basically every other endgame in the world.
Yeah, I think I read it somewhere, very much meant to be considered tongue-in-cheek, but all rook endgames are drawn.
Yeah, that said, I'm not sure this is one of them. I think that the black king is cut off on the last rank, and the white king is getting extremely active coming forward. So I think this might be a rook endgame that white is going to be able to convert. And we have another couple of quick moves since there is time pressure, and it looks like white has made some serious progress getting this pawn up the board. Yes, exactly, except for when the rook endgames are not drawn.
Yeah, very much Kulma showing the spirit of Siegbert Tarrasch.
Okay, so after rook h6, it looks like we had f6, king e8, and king e6, threatening mate. And this is actually going to be a winning position for white. Actually, did I miss a move in there? Somehow we had a check first somewhere.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it does look like somewhere rook h5 was played. Uh-oh. Let's see if we can figure this out.
Yeah, f5, king e8, then f6.
f6.
We did not have rook g6. I think I had included an extra move in there.
Okay. Got it.
And we are somehow to... Wow, we've gotten a long way. Okay. Let's hop back to the live position real quick so that we can see what's going on the big board. And it looks like white's pawn on f6 is very, very close to becoming a queen, and black is going to have to sacrifice a rook for that pawn at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of those situations, down on time and down on position. It is really tough to play black now.
Yes.
Charlie making the decision not to let the b pawn go and rush for the win, but to instead take his time, play rook to b6, although this does maybe allow Lenny to continue making threats.
Yeah, I think this is giving him a chance to maybe climb back into the game if he can win a pawn. If white tries to defend this with rook to b5, then black has the move king c6, and I don't see anything better than repeating for white.
Absolutely, yeah. Highlighting there the incredible difference between the rook and the queen. Right, one of the places that most shows itself is in the endgame, where the queen cannot be bothered by the king, but the rook
Right.
very often can be harassed.
So we seem to have gotten to a Lucina position here with the white king in front of the pawn. And this is a well known win for the stronger side. So this is a well known win for white. While the king is cut off at this exact moment, white's idea is going to be to build a bridge. So white is going to want to bring his rook to a good square here on e5 so that he can then bring the king out and at an opportune moment play rook f5 to stop all of the checks. Now, in this
Absolutely.
specific case, white also has additional ideas because he has an extra pawn on b2, but he's going to have to be very careful that he doesn't lose that b pawn.
Absolutely. It doesn't look like Charlie's familiar with this particular position and theory, however, as he decides to play rook to a7 instead. So we are going to see. It may be that Charlie just doesn't quite have the idea to bring this point home.
Yeah, it looks like Lenny's doing the right thing and keeping the rook on the g file. It seems to be a good square and just passing for the moment. And he's going to force his opponent to find this Lucina idea to convert the position.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do see, I think that was a mistake, in my opinion, of Charlie's to decide to trade those pawns. I think that does simplify Black's task. And now, unless White knows the idea, I think we're going to see a draw agreed pretty soon.
Maybe, although White does have this idea of rook g7, and then he'll have the g8 square for his king. So it's a position where I think White's going to find a way to win no matter what.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, not as clear as I had thought.
And this is a little bit of an interesting position because I think that after king g8, king e7 looks like a move that might defend this f8 square, but f8 queen is a double check, and it would force black to move the king.
Ouch. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, let's see. It looks like Charlie
And I
has
think we're going to get that on the
that same
board.
detail.
And there it is.
Oh, nothing left to do.
Nope. And Lenny gives it up, and Charlie comes away with the victory.
Wow. So the rating difference, not enough to make up for perhaps some advantage with the white pieces. A little bit of an unexpected result. Really excellent game played by both players. Went down to the wire. And I have to say, really wonderful and interesting experience for us commentating and hopefully for the audience. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, this was a really interesting game, and thank you so much for the opportunity to take a look at it.
Absolutely. Andrew, before I let you go, do you think, did Black have any opportunity to save the draw there?
I don't know. It went very, very quickly. Maybe let's see if we can come up with the game and take a look at it. So let me see if I can take a look at it. Okay, so we've got the game loaded up on the big board, so we can take a quick look at it. Let's hop basically all the way to the end game and see if there was anything that Black could have done to try and save the game. So again, here, I think after h4, this was probably the last really good opportunity. And I think the move h5, although it's going to make this pawn very weak, I think this gives Black excellent chances to hold. So this probably would have been the critical move that would have given Black the best chances to hold the draw.
Yeah, absolutely. That is an interesting idea, holding back that pawn. But maybe now here I would try something like bishop d2, bishop g5 to try and unseat that blockading rook.
Yeah, I think the only problem with that is if the bishop moves, now all of a sudden we can take on e6 because there are no more threats on g7.
Missing the obvious. Yes, very good point.
And
That's very
I don't know that white has the time to bring the king forward. Uh, I mean, obviously we could end up with a uh, short Timon game where the king comes all the way to g5, but I think that's a long king walk.
Yeah, that's always been one of my favorites. Yes, and it occurs to me that the ideas of bringing the king up, although they make sense, maybe there's some opportunity for Black to activate his own king and prevent some of these problems. I'm realizing, of course, I was about to begin by saying maybe even king to f8, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe do we run into trouble there?
I think we do. I think we have this check, and after rook e8, I think there are going to be ideas of bishop takes g7, which is a nice tactic to pick off a pawn.
Absolutely. Yeah, wonderful. Remove the guard there.
And it looks
Okay.
even worse than that because after this, we're going to be able to do this and kind of zone out the black king so that it can't approach the pawn.
Ouch. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, really well played by both players. Would have been interesting to see what could have happened if we could have gifted Lenny Shulgin an extra 5 minutes near the end. But
Yes, yeah,
all in
Lenny's
all,
in the chat and talking about playing this knight f8 move, and that's exactly right. And that was one of the things that we were talking about during the game. If you do have this knight f8 move, and all of a sudden this e6 pawn, it's not possible to defend it. So that would have been a really nice resource to have show up on the board.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That is really nice.
Let's take a
Well,
quick look at the rook endgame before we call it a wrap and see if there was any
great.
chance that black had to kind of hold everything. So I think this is kind of when after a4, this is probably one of the few moments that black might have been able to try and come up with something. I think this knight on d5, that's the best possible square for the knight. So now maybe it's worth considering a move like rook e6 to attack this bishop.
Yeah. Yeah, this would have, I have to say, I liked, one of the things that I liked about this position was just that it kept the knight on. And of course,
Mm,
unfortunately, with Lenny, the one with time pressure, it's not quite as good as I've seen it be elsewhere. But in general, I love the resource of the knight fork and trying to keep something in my pocket that I might be able to catch him with at an odd moment.
exactly. Although I think with this king stuck on the last rank, that I think it's going to be too hard to find a good way to hold a draw here. I think white's eventually going to march this king forward and just have some mating ideas mixed with the threats of winning this pawn, either with the king coming to c6 or b5 or the bishop coming to c7.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very difficult position indeed. Well, Andrew, I want to thank you immensely for offering us your expertise and your insight to this game tonight. I want to thank all of you out in the audience for coming, and anyone watching this on recording, thank you very much for showing up. And we look very much forward to doing some more events like these. I will be trying to highlight what I consider to be interesting games. We'll be looking at postmortem analysis after games have concluded and doing some other sorts of video features here on what will henceforward be known as acceptable chess. So, Andrew, for
Awesome.
Andrew Hoy, I am John Harden. Thank you all so much for coming and have a good night.